I found my husband's secret apartment, his hidden girlfriend, and his plan to steal $5 million from me, so I invited her to his victory party, and nobody saw what was coming next. The laptop screen lit up the inside of our closet like a flashlight under a blanket. I was sitting on the floor between his winter coats and a box of old tax documents, and I was not breathing right. 4 years of messages. 4 years, laid out in a thread I never knew existed, and my thumb kept scrolling because some stupid, stubborn part of me thought the next message might explain the last one. It never did. You're basically my landlord at this point. He'd written to someone named Jenna 11 months ago. I pay the bills. I show up when I have to. Then, 3 weeks after that, she's dead weight. I just haven't figured out the exit yet. I read that line 4 times. I wanted it to say something else the 5th time. It didn't. I could hear the dryer running down the hall, tumbling a load of Grant's gym clothes, because Grant was at the gym, because Grant was always somewhere else on Tuesday nights, and I had never once thought to ask why a man who hated cardio suddenly loved the 7 o'clock spin class. My hands were shaking so hard I had to set the laptop down on my knees. There was a lease. An apartment on the 9th floor of a building called the Marlowe, downtown, 11 minutes from our house, signed under the name Colin Whitfield, Grant's brother's name. Grant's handwriting was all over the margins of the PDF, notes to himself about furniture delivery windows. There was a woman named Jenna Coulter, who believed my husband was a single founder, with dead parents, and a startup he'd built from nothing. Alone, brave, unattached. There was a folder labeled simply I5M, and inside it, an email thread with a wire coordinator about moving money somewhere with looser reporting requirements before, in his words, the paperwork with E gets messy. E was me. I had a first initial in my own husband's plan to disappear. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark of the closet for a long moment, breathing through my nose, feeling something in my chest go from hot to cold, the way a burn does right before it stops hurting and starts just being numb. Then I heard the garage door open. Grant, home from the gym, whistling something tuneless in the driveway. I put the laptop back exactly where I'd found it. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, and by the time he walked through the door, I was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of something on the stove, and I smiled at him the way I'd smiled at him for 6 years. Good workout? I asked. Killer, he said, kissing the top of my head like nothing in the world was wrong. I stirred the pot and said nothing, because I had already decided, in the space of about 4 minutes on a closet floor, that Grant Whitfield was not going to see me coming. To understand how I got to that closet floor, you have to understand who Grant was before he was that, because he wasn't always a man with a secret apartment and a girlfriend who thought his parents were dead. Or maybe he was, and I just hadn't learned to see it yet. I met Grant Whitfield in the spring of 2016 at a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital where I worked as an ICU nurse. I was 24. He was 27, 4 months out from launching his first company, a startup called Vantage Metrics, that promised to help small businesses track customer data more efficiently. He was funny in that specific way ambitious men are funny, self-deprecating just enough to seem humble, confident just enough to seem safe. He asked me what it was like to hold someone's hand while they died, and when I told him, he didn't flinch. He just listened. I decided that night that a man who could sit still through that story was a man worth knowing. We married in October of 2019 at a vineyard outside Boulder, Colorado, in front of 80 guests and a string quartet his mother insisted on. I was 27. He was 30. My mother had passed the year before from ovarian cancer, so my father walked me down the aisle alone, and I remember Grant squeezing my hand right before the ceremony started, like he understood exactly how much that absence weighed on the day. For a long time, I held on to that memory as proof of something, proof that underneath everything else, he saw me. But even then, in the earliest years, there were things I filed away without looking at too closely. In late 2018, before we married, Vantage Metrics fell apart. Grant's co-founder, a quiet, meticulous man named Ray Doss, accused Grant of inflating user growth numbers to a Series A investor group, padding the metrics that gave the company its name. There was an investigation, threats of a lawsuit, a settlement that came with a non-disclosure agreement neither of us was ever supposed to talk about. Grant told me Ray was jealous, unstable, a man who couldn't handle watching someone else succeed. He cried when he told me. He said Ray had tried to destroy everything he'd built out of pure resentment. I believed him completely. I gave him $40,000 to believe him. It was money from my mother's estate, the only real inheritance I'd ever gotten, meant to be a down payment on a life I hadn't figured out yet. Grant needed it to cover his portion of the legal fees the settlement required. A bridge, he said, until the next round of funding came through for whatever he built next. He promised to pay it back within the year. I never saw a cent of it again, and somewhere around year 2 of our marriage, I stopped bringing it up because every time I did, his face would go tight and wounded, like I was the one being cruel. That was the first lesson I didn't know I was learning. With Grant, the story always had a villain, and it was never him. He rebuilt fast. By 2021, he'd launched Verity Compliance, a software platform that helped healthcare companies automate regulatory audits, an industry he understood partly because of me, because of years of me coming home exhausted from documentation requirements that ate half my shifts. He used to joke that I was his unpaid research department. I used to think that was sweet. In hindsight, I think it was the first version of a pattern that would define our whole marriage. Grant taking what was mine and calling it inspiration. In March of 2022, we refinanced our house to lower the interest rate, a normal, boring piece of adult paperwork I barely thought twice about. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until years later, was that buried inside that same digital signing portal, Grant had also opened a home equity line of credit against the house. $85,000, drawn down over 6 months, routed into Verity's early operating account as informal seed capital. My name was on the loan documents. I never signed them. I only ever signed what he told me to sign, on a screen, in a hurry, on a Tuesday night, while dinner was burning on the stove and he stood behind me saying, just initial there, and there, and there. We're almost done. I trusted him with paperwork the way I trusted him with everything else. Completely. And without asking the second question. Money was always a strange, lopsided subject between us, and it took me years to notice the shape of the imbalance. Grant kept a running commentary on my spending that I mistook for a long time for thriftiness. He'd question a $40 dinner with Priya, ask whether I'd really needed a new pair of work shoes when the old ones still had life in them, while his own Amex statement, the one tied to Verity's early expense account, quietly absorbed things like a $600 dinner with investors or a conference trip to Austin that somehow required a suite instead of a standard room. I didn't see the statement until much later, when it became evidence instead of a mystery. At the time, I just felt vaguely guilty about the shoes. My father noticed something before I did, though he never said it outright, not the way Dana eventually would. Frank Marsh had been a quiet, careful man his whole life, an electrician who'd raised 2 daughters alone after my mother's diagnosis, stretched what should have been a slow decline into 3 brutal years. He liked Grant well enough at first, admired his ambition the way men of my father's generation admire ambition, as a kind of proof of character. But at our wedding reception, during the father-daughter dance, he'd held me a little too tightly and said close to my ear, "You let me know if that boy ever makes you feel small. I don't care how much money he makes." I laughed it off that night. I told him Grant would never. I believed it completely, standing there in my dress, 27 years old and certain I'd already found the hardest part of life and survived it. There was a night in the summer of 2023 I think about now more than almost any other. We were at a barbecue at his parents' house, Warren and Carol Whitfield out in Golden, and Grant had a few beers in him and got loose in that way he sometimes did, telling stories to impress his father's business friends. He told one about Ray Doss, the old Vantage Metrics partner, and how badly Ray had wanted to take Grant down. Someone asked what happened to Ray. Grant laughed and said, "Last I heard he's doing sales for some medical device company in Ohio. Guess integrity doesn't pay the bills." I remember Carol laughing along, and Warren clapping Grant on the back, and me standing there with a lemonade in my hand, feeling something small and cold move through me that I didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't suspicion exactly. It was more like a draft coming through a window I hadn't noticed was open. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a lot of things were nothing, for a long time, because the alternative was believing my husband was capable of the thing I would eventually find on that laptop, and believing that was so much harder than not looking. That was the marriage I thought I had, right up until the night my sister called me crying. Dana called on a Thursday, her voice cracking before she even finished my name. She'd been downtown at a jewelry store on Larimer Street, picking up a repair for her engagement ring, when she saw Grant through the window. He was standing at the counter with a woman who wasn't me, holding her hand across the glass display case like it belonged to him, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I almost didn't say anything, Dana told me. I thought maybe it was a work thing, a client. But Elena, he was looking at her the way he used to look at you. I felt cold when she said it. Not angry yet. Cold, like a wall going up brick by brick somewhere behind my ribs. Methodical, load-bearing, built to hold something heavy. I didn't confront him that night. I've thought a lot about why, and I think it's because 20 years of nursing teaches you that the worst thing you can do in an emergency is act before you understand what you're looking at. So I checked our joint accounts first, quietly, on my phone in the bathroom with the fan running. Nothing missing. Grant was careful. He'd always kept a separate business account for Verity that I never touched, never asked about, because I trusted him, and because I had my own paycheck, my own sense of independence I was proud of. So I waited. I smiled at dinner. I asked him about his day, and he told me about a due diligence call with a company called Anchor Point Health Systems, a potential acquirer circling Verity, and how close they were to a real number. I said that was wonderful. I meant it in that moment. I still believed that Thursday night that whatever this was, it might have an explanation I could survive. 2 nights later, he went to the gym like always, and I took his old laptop out of the closet, which brings you back to where this story started. To me, on the floor, reading the word landlord, reading the word dead weight, learning that the man I married had built an entire second life 11 minutes from our front door, and that he had a plan to disappear from mine. I want to be honest about something because this story only means anything if I am. In the days after that closet floor, I did not fall apart. I did not scream, or throw his things onto the lawn, or call him crying at 2 in the morning demanding answers. Some part of that was self-control. A bigger part of it, if I'm being truthful, was that 6 years of marriage to a man like Grant had trained me, slowly and invisibly, to manage my reactions around him, to present things calmly, to pick my moments. I didn't recognize that training as a wound until much later. In the moment, it just felt like strategy. And strategy, it turned out, was exactly what I was going to need. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories and better audio quality. Now back back to the video. The first thing I did, once the shock cooled into something I could actually use, was go back through the laptop with a nurse's eye instead of a wife's. Methodical. No skimming. I made a folder on a flash drive and started documenting everything with timestamps, the way I'd been trained to chart a patient's decline, in order, without editorializing, because someone downstream was going to need the record to make sense. That was step one. It felt manageable, contained. I told myself that once I had the full picture, I would know what to do with it. Step two came 4 days later, when I found the email thread that changed the shape of everything. It wasn't about Jenna at all. It was between Grant and a man named Foster Whitlock, a wealth structuring consultant whose signature block listed an office in the Cayman Islands. The subject line read, Verity Exit, Timeline. Grant had written, plainly, in the kind of business-like shorthand that made it worse somehow, that the Anchor Point acquisition was closing at $5 million, and that he wanted the bulk of it moved into a structure Foster could set up before what he called the situation resolves. He wasn't planning to tell me the deal existed. He was planning to let it close, move the money somewhere I'd never find it, and only then start the divorce, on his terms, with numbers I would never get to see. I would be left with the house, the mortgage, and no idea that there had ever been $5 million to divide in the first place. I read the thread 3 times, then a fourth, the way you reread a diagnosis you already understand, just to see if it might somehow rearrange itself into something survivable. It never did. I sat with that for a long time. Longer than I sat with the affair, honestly, because an affair is a betrayal of the heart, and I could almost have found a way to survive that if he'd come to me and told me the truth. This was different. This was a plan. This required spreadsheets and lawyers and months of quiet, deliberate lying, not to hurt me in a moment of weakness, but to profit from hurting me with the precision of a man running a business. Step 3 was Jenna herself. I didn't want to know about her, and then I couldn't stop needing to. I found her online in an evening, a marketing coordinator at a design firm downtown, 29 years old, a woman with a bright, easy smile in every photo, a woman who posted things like proud of my guy, under a picture of Grant standing in front of a whiteboard I recognized from his own office, the one I'd helped him pick out at a furniture warehouse in 2021. She had no idea. That was the worst part. She wasn't a villain in this. She was exactly what I had been 3 years into my marriage before I learned to notice the drafts coming through the windows. He'd told her his parents were dead, so she'd never think to ask why she'd never meet them. He told her he built Verity alone, in a garage, the classic founder myth, when the truth was that half the operating cash in that company's first year came out of my mother's memory and my house's equity. I sat with that too, longer than I expected to. Step 4 was the escalation I hadn't planned for, the one where Grant, without knowing anything I'd found, made things worse on his own. On a Tuesday night over dinner, he brought up his mother. Mom's been asking why you seem distant lately, he said, spearing a piece of chicken like the observation cost him nothing. I told her you're just stressed with work, but maybe you could call her. She worries. It was a small thing. It shouldn't have landed the way it did. But I understood, sitting there, that he was laying groundwork, quietly recruiting witnesses to a story where I was the one who'd pulled away first, the one whose distance needed explaining, so that when the divorce eventually came, on his terms, at his chosen time, there would already be a narrative in place. I wasn't just his wife anymore. I was a character he was writing, carefully, for an audience that hadn't been told the play had already started. I responded reasonably. I always responded reasonably, because I had learned over years with him that reasonable was the only currency he couldn't argue with. I'll call her this weekend, I said, and I did. I sat on the phone with Carol Whitfield for 40 minutes, laughing at her stories about her garden, giving nothing away, gathering information the way I'd been gathering everything else. She mentioned, almost in passing, that Grant had asked his father for advice about structuring things for the sale, and that Warren had told him to be careful, because deals like that could get messy if a marriage wasn't stable. I filed that away too. Warren, it seemed, already had questions. He just hadn't asked them out loud yet. Step 5 was the paperwork oddity, the one I almost missed entirely, the one that would matter more than anything else in the end. I was going through our old file cabinet looking for something unrelated, a car title, when I found the closing documents from our 2022 refinance. Stapled behind them, in a folder I'd never opened, was a second set of paperwork, a HELOC, $85,000, my signature at the bottom, in ink that wasn't mine, in a hand that curved the E in Elena the wrong way, a small, careless forgery that anyone who actually knew my handwriting would catch in half a second. I stared at that signature for a long time. It wasn't just that he'd taken $85,000 out of our house without telling me, it was that he'd forged my name to do it, quietly, casually. The same week he stood behind me at the kitchen counter saying just initial there and there, banking on the fact that I'd never think to check what else might have slipped through that same signing session. It was a small, cold discovery, tucked behind a stack of unrelated paperwork, and it would turn out to be the single most important piece of evidence in this entire story, but I didn't know that yet. That night, it just felt like one more brick in a wall that had gotten so tall I could barely see over it anymore. Step 6 came 2 nights later, and it was the closest he ever came to catching me. I'd left the flash drive in my nightstand drawer instead of my locker at work, a mistake born of exhaustion, and I woke up at 1 in the morning to find Grant sitting on the edge of the bed, wide awake, scrolling through his phone with an odd, restless energy. My heart nearly stopped until I realized he wasn't looking through anything of mine. He was looking at a text text from Jenna, and something in it had unsettled him enough to lose sleep over it. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice thick with performed grogginess, every nerve in my body screaming. "Work stuff," he said. "Investors getting cold feet on timing. It's fine." He set the phone face down on the nightstand, close enough that I could have reached it if I wanted to, and I understood, lying there in the dark, that Jenna herself had started asking questions he didn't have good answers for yet. He hadn't caught me. He was too busy managing his own unraveling story to notice mine. The very next evening, he tried a different approach entirely, one I recognized immediately for what it was because I'd watched him do it to his mother, to old business partners, to anyone who ever pushed back on him even slightly. He came home early, unprompted, and found me in the kitchen. He didn't bring up his mother this time. He brought up his health. "I had chest tightness on my run today," he said, sitting heavily at the table, rubbing his sternum with 2 fingers in a way that looked to me entirely too practiced. "Probably stress. This deal's taking everything out of me, and I feel like I'm doing it without any support at home lately. 6 months earlier, I would have dropped everything. I would have taken his blood pressure myself, driven him to urgent care, spent the night awake listening to him breathe. Instead, I felt something in me go very still and very clear, the particular stillness of a nurse who has learned to recognize a symptom from a performance. I asked reasonable questions. Had he seen a doctor? Did he want me to make an appointment? I offered exactly the support a good wife offers, and no more, and I watched his face flicker with something like disappointment when the crisis didn't produce the reaction he was fishing for. He dropped it within the hour, ate a full dinner, and went to bed without another word about his heart. Step 7 was the ceiling I thought I'd hit, and then didn't. Grant announced, over breakfast on a Sunday, that Verity's deal with Anchor Point was closing. He didn't give me a number. He gave me a date, Friday, and he told me, almost as an afterthought, buttering his toast like it was nothing, that there'd be a launch party that same night, a combined celebration for a new product release and the acquisition at a gallery space downtown called The Foundry. "I want you there," he said. "Come a little later than me, closer to 8. I've got some early stuff to handle with the investors before that." He smiled at me over his coffee, the same smile from the vineyard in Boulder, the same smile he'd used my whole marriage to make me feel chosen. "It's going to be a big night, Elle." I understood exactly what that smile meant. He wanted a photograph, a proof-of-life shot of a happy, loyal wife standing beside him on the night his deal closed, right before he vanished with the proceeds and a woman named Jenna, who thought his parents were dead. He needed the story to look clean for however long it took him to disappear. So I smiled back at him across the breakfast table and I said I wouldn't miss it for the world. And that was the truth. I wasn't going to miss it. I had already decided, somewhere between the closet floor and the forged signature, that if Grant wanted a stage for the night his plan came together, I would build him one. I just had different plans for who the audience would see standing in the spotlight. I called Priya first. Priya Anand had been my closest friend since nursing school, back when we were both 22 and terrified of our first codes, and her husband Holt Bregman had spent the last decade handling divorce cases for a firm downtown. I told Priya everything, sitting in her kitchen with the flash drive between us on the counter like something radioactive, and she didn't say a single word about how sorry she was. She just picked up her phone and called Holt, and 40 minutes later I was sitting across from him in a coffee shop 3 towns over, choosing somewhere far enough away that no one we knew would walk in and see us together. Holt read through everything I had, the texts, the lease, the email thread with Foster Whitlock, the HELOC, and the signature that wasn't mine. He didn't rush. He asked good, careful questions, the kind that made me realize how much I still didn't know, and how much of what I did know might actually matter in a courtroom instead of just in my own chest. "Timing is everything here," he told me finally, tapping the printed email thread with one finger. "If that wire clears before we've got something filed, we're not fighting your husband anymore. We're fighting a bank account in the Caymans, and that's a much longer, much more expensive fight. We need to move before Friday, not after." I asked him what moving before Friday actually meant. "An emergency motion," he said. "A temporary restraining order on marital assets, based on evidence of dissipation, which is exactly what that Whitlock email shows. If a judge signs it, and I think a judge will sign it given what you've got, it goes straight to compliance at whatever bank receives that wire. It won't stop the sale from closing. It can't undo a contract that's already in motion. But it can freeze what lands, the second it lands, before your husband gets the chance to move it anywhere else." He looked at the forged HELOC signature again, and something in his face changed, sharpened. "This," he said, tapping it, "this is the part that actually scares me for him. Infidelity is heartbreak. This is fraud. If that signature isn't yours, and I believe you that it isn't, this isn't just a stronger divorce case. This is a different kind of problem for Grant entirely." I asked him to file it, all of it, as fast as he legally could. He told me it would take a few days to prepare properly, to make sure nothing in the filing gave Grant any reason to suspect what was coming before it landed. I told him Friday was the deadline either way, because Friday was the day the deal closed, and Friday was the day of the party, and I intended to be standing in that gallery when whatever came next arrived. I didn't tell Grant any of this, obviously. For the rest of that week, I was the wife he thought he knew. I asked about the deal. I let him talk about the exit multiple like it impressed me, the way it always used to. I picked out a dress for the party, a plain black one, nothing that would draw attention before I wanted it drawn. And underneath all of it, every single day, a piece of paper was moving quietly through a courthouse downtown, waiting for a judge's signature, waiting for Friday, the same as the rest of of us. I sent Jenna the invitation myself from an account with no name attached to it 3 days before the party. I framed it as a networking event, a launch celebration open to industry contacts, and I promised, in the last line, that there would be a special announcement worth attending in person. I found her professional email through the design firm's website in about 90 seconds. It felt strange, reaching directly into the life Grant had hidden from me and pulling one thread of it into the room where I intended to stand. But I told myself she deserved to be there for the same reason I did. She was living inside a story that was about to end, whether either of us chose it or not, and I decided that if Grant's story was going to collapse, it should collapse in front of everyone he'd built it for, not quietly, later, in private, on his terms. I invited his parents too. Warren and Carol had a standing invitation to anything involving the company anyway, so it raised no questions when I called Carol myself and told her how proud I was of Grant, how much it would mean to have them there, front row, close enough to see everything. Carol sounded delighted. She told me she'd get her hair done for it. I told her that sounded lovely, and I meant that too, in a strange, sad way I didn't fully understand until much later. By Thursday night, everything was in place except the one piece none of us could control. Holt called me at 9 that evening to say the motion had been filed that afternoon and that a judge was expected to review it first thing Friday morning, given the urgency laid out in the paperwork. There were no guarantees. Judges moved on their own schedule. Not on mine, not on Grant's, not on a deal closing at 5 o'clock the next day. All we could do now was wait and show up and see which piece of Friday arrived first. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay next to Grant, listening to him breathe evenly beside me, a man who had no idea that somewhere in a courthouse 11 miles away, a piece of paper with his name on it was sitting in a stack, waiting for a stranger to decide whether the next chapter of his life would go the way he'd planned it or the way I had. Friday came in gray and ordinary, the kind of morning that gives no warning about what it's about to hold. Grant left early, humming, checking his phone every few minutes with the particular energy of a man watching a number get bigger, somewhere he couldn't see. I went to work, saw my patients, signed my charts, and checked my own phone exactly as often as he checked his, waiting for a different kind of update. At 2 in the afternoon, Holt texted me a single line, signed, sending to the bank's compliance department now. No promises on timing, but it's moving. I read it standing in a hospital hallway, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I let myself cry, just for a moment, just in a stairwell where no one could see me, before I wiped my face and went back to my patients like nothing had happened at all. It was, I think, the last time I cried before that party. Everything after that felt too sharp-edged and clear for tears. I got to the foundry a little before 8, in the plain black dress, my hair down, my hands steady in a way that surprised me. The gallery had been transformed for the night, string lights strung across exposed brick, a bar set up near the back wall, a low stage at the front with a projector screen behind it, ready to display whatever slide deck Grant had built to tell his version of the story of Verity compliance. I recognized half the crowd, colleagues of his, a few investors I'd met at other functions over the years, and near the front, sharp in a gray suit, Warren Whitfield, with Carol beside him in a floral dress and freshly curled hair, exactly as promised. Grant found me almost immediately, grabbing my hand a little too hard, pulling me toward the front of the room like I was a prop being moved into position for a photograph, which I suppose I was. He looked electric that night, lit up from the inside in a way I hadn't seen in years, and I understood, watching him work the room, that this wasn't just a deal closing for him. This was the version of himself he'd been trying to become since Vantage Metrics fell apart in 2018. The version where he finally won, decisively, publicly, with everyone watching. He climbed onto the low stage a little after 8:30 and tapped the microphone. The room quieted. I stood near the front, exactly where he'd positioned me, and I scanned the crowd once, slowly. I found Jenna almost immediately, standing near the bar in a dark green dress, radiant, nervous, glancing toward the stage like she was waiting for something. She had no idea yet that the wife standing at the front of the room was anything other than an ex, or an assistant, or a stranger. Grant had never described me to her in any way that would have let her recognize my face. Grant's speech was, in its own way, a masterpiece. He talked about the sleepless early nights building Verity from nothing. He thanked his team. He thanked his parents for believing in him, and Warren nodded, and Carol dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. And I stood there thinking about $85,000 drawn against our house and $40,000 from my dead mother's estate, watching a man take a bow for a foundation neither of us had built alone. Then he looked directly at me across the room in front of everyone, with an expression of such convincing tenderness that for one disorienting second, some old tired part of me almost believed it again. And to my wife, he said, who has supported me through every version of this journey, I couldn't have done any of this without you. It was, I would learn much later, almost word for word a line he'd rehearsed with Jenna 2 nights earlier, describing what he planned to say to close out the speech before the real announcement, the one about their future, once the deal cleared and the timing was finally right. I didn't know that yet, standing there. I only knew that it made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't fully explain in the moment. I'm incredibly excited, he continued, turning back to the crowd, for the next chapter of my life. That was my line. That was the exact door he'd left open, without meaning to, and I walked straight through it. I pulled my phone from my clutch and connected it to the projector cable that was already, conveniently, sitting coiled at the edge of the stage. The Verity logo blinked off the screen behind him. For a beat, nothing but a blank blue rectangle, and a low murmur of confusion moving through the crowd. Then the first image loaded. The lease for apartment 9C at the Marlowe. Colin Whitfield's name at the top. Grant's handwriting in the margins. The room didn't gasp. It went silent in that specific, heavy way a room goes silent when it understands all at once that something real is happening. "Grant," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. Steady the way it gets when a patient's monitor starts alarming, and you've trained your whole life not to let your hands shake. "Why don't you tell everyone about the next chapter?" I clicked to the next slide before he could answer. A screenshot of the text where he called me his landlord. Then the one where he called me dead weight. Time-stamped. Unmistakable. Then a photo I'd pulled from a public real estate listing site. The same apartment building. Cross-referenced against the jewelry store receipt Dana had photographed weeks earlier. Time-stamped and clear. A ring. A hand that wasn't mine. Grant turned around slowly to face the screen, and I watched his face go the color of chalk. Watched 30 years of careful confidence drain out of him in real time, in front of the exact people he'd built that confidence to impress. "You don't understand," he said, turning back to the room, his voice climbing towards something desperate. There's context here. This isn't what it looks like." Near the bar, I heard glass shatter. Jenna had dropped her drink. She was staring at the screen, then at me, then back at Grant, her face moving through confusion and recognition and horror in the space of about 4 seconds, faster than I would have thought a person could process something that large. She said something I couldn't hear over the murmur of the crowd, just once, sharp, and then she pushed through the people around her and ran for the door, her heels loud and uneven against the gallery floor. I didn't feel triumphant watching her go. I felt something closer to recognition. She was exactly who I'd been, 3 years into loving a man who was very good at making people feel chosen right up until the moment he needed them gone. Warren Whitfield stood up first. I watched him do it, slow and deliberate. A man who had spent his whole life believing certain things about his son that were now visibly, publicly collapsing in front of him. "Grant," he said, and his voice carried across the whole gallery. "What in God's name is this?" "Dad, I can explain." "You can't," Warren said. "You can't explain a secret apartment. You can't explain forging documents." He didn't know about the HELOC yet, not the details, but something in his face told me he already suspected there was more underneath this than an affair, that a man who lies this completely about one thing rarely stops at just the one thing. I sat there and told my friends how proud I was of you tonight. Carol reached over and took my hand, hers cold and trembling. "We need to leave," she whispered to me, not to Grant. "Right now, Elena, come with me." Grant lunged toward me instead, grabbing my arm hard enough that I felt it the next morning, a small purple bruise I didn't bother covering up. "You don't understand the context," he hissed, close to my face now, all pretense gone, nothing left of the man from the stage. "Just let me explain." I looked at him, really looked at him, the way you look at something you're finally seeing clearly for the first time, and I felt no fear at all, which surprised me more than anything else that night. "I understand perfectly," I said, quiet enough that only he could hear it, calm enough that my voice didn't shake once. "The moving truck is already at the house. Your things are being dropped off at Colin's apartment as we speak. And Grant, that account you're waiting on, the $5 million, a judge signed an order this morning. Whatever hits that account isn't going anywhere." His mouth opened. Nothing came out. I watched him do the math in real time, watched him understand, in front of his own parents, in front of the people he most wanted to impress, that the woman he'd called dead weight had been 3 steps ahead of him the entire time. I turned and walked out of that gallery while he was still standing there, still searching for words that weren't going to come. The cold night air hit my face on the sidewalk outside, sharp and clean, and I stood there for a moment just breathing it in. For the first time in 3 weeks, maybe for the first time in longer than that, I felt like I could actually fill my lungs all the way. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a minute before I turned the key, watching my phone light up over and over. Carol calling twice, her name flashing on the screen like something urgent. Dana texting in all caps, 3 messages, then 4. A cluster of alerts from our home security app. Motion detected at the front door, motion detected in the driveway, the movers I'd hired that week, finishing the job I'd been quietly planning for 11 days. I ignored every notification and drove home. The movers were exactly where they were supposed to be. A small crew I'd arranged through a company 2 towns over, working under a simple set of instructions Holt had helped me draft to keep everything defensible later. Grant's clothes, his books, the framed photos from his office, all of it tagged with small red stickers, and carried out the front door in neat, efficient trips, while the sky went from orange to purple to black behind them. I stood on the porch and watched, arms crossed against the cold, feeling less like a woman getting revenge and more like someone finally, calmly, finishing a task that had been sitting unfinished for years. By 11 that night, the house was quieter than I'd heard it in a long time. Half-empty closets, a dent in the carpet where his recliner used to sit. I made a cup of tea I didn't really want just to have something to hold, and I sat at the kitchen table, and for a little while I let myself believe it was over. I had the evidence, I had the party, I had watched his own father call him a disgrace to his face. I thought I had already won. Then, just after midnight, my phone rang one more time. It wasn't Grant, it wasn't Carol or Warren or anyone from that gallery. It was Holt. I answered on the second ring, and something in his voice was different from every conversation we'd had that week. Tighter, more careful, the voice of a man choosing his words before he said them. "We have a problem," he said. I just got off a call with the bank's compliance officer. My stomach dropped straight through the kitchen floor. "Say that again." again, I whispered, my tea going cold in front of me, the whole quiet house suddenly feeling too loud. The wire, Holt said. It cleared this morning, before your order even reached the bank, before the party started. I sat completely still, the phone pressed hard against my ear, watching the red dot of the porch light blink through the kitchen window. The 5 million, Holt said, slower now, giving each word room to land. It's already gone. I want to tell you that I panicked in that moment, but the truth is stranger than that. I just went very quiet inside, the way I used to go quiet in a code, when the noise of the room fell away and all that was left was the next single thing that needed doing. Gone where? I asked, and I heard my own voice come out flat and clear, a nurse's voice, a voice built for emergencies. Not offshore, Holt said, and I could hear him exhale, the tightness in his voice easing a half degree. That's the part that matters. The wire cleared into a domestic account Grant opened at a regional bank 2 weeks ago, one we didn't even know about until the compliance officer mentioned it. It landed there this morning. But here's the thing, Elena. Our order reached that same bank's legal department by 1:40 this afternoon, hours before the party, hours before you even walked into that gallery. I sat with that for a second, trying to make the timeline hold still in my head. The account's frozen, Holt said. It has been since 1:40. He never had access to that money tonight, not for one single minute. Whatever he thought he was celebrating at that party, it was already sitting in a locked box before he ever stepped onto that stage. Somewhere behind my ribs, the wall I'd built brick by brick over 3 weeks let out a long, slow breath. So it's not gone, I said. It's not gone, Holt confirmed. It's just not his. Not yet. Not without a fight, and Elena, given what we've got, I don't think it's much of a fight. I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that, staring at the cold tea in front of me, feeling something I hadn't let myself feel yet through any of it. Not triumph, something quieter and more complicated than that. Relief, yes. But underneath the relief, something closer to grief. The specific kind of grief that shows up only after the danger has passed, when your body finally has room to notice everything it survived. The weeks after that night moved faster than I expected and slower than I could stand, sometimes in the same afternoon. The freeze on the account held. Holt filed the full divorce petition the following Monday, built around everything I'd handed him weeks earlier, the texts, the lease, the Foster Whitlock emails, and the HELOC with the forged signature, which turned out to matter even more than either of us had guessed. Once a forensic document examiner confirmed what I already knew in my gut, that the E in my signature curved the wrong direction, that it wasn't my handwriting under any reasonable analysis, the case stopped being just a bitter divorce and became something with real teeth. Holt referred that piece separately to the bank's fraud department, since Grant had used my identity to draw funds from a joint asset without my knowledge or consent, and that referral opened a door I hadn't fully understood the size of until later, a door that had nothing to do with our marriage and everything to do with the law. Grant tried everything in those first weeks. He tried calling me, over and over, alternating between apology and fury depending on the hour. He tried routing messages through Dana, who told him, in words I won't repeat here, exactly what she thought of him. He tried, at one particularly low point, showing up at the hospital during my shift, standing near the parking garage until hospital security asked him to leave, a moment that would later become its own small, useful line in the eventual protective order Holt filed on my behalf. He also tried, and this was the part that told me the most about who he actually was underneath everything, to salvage the story publicly before he tried to salvage anything else. A mutual friend told me Grant had started telling people, quietly, that I'd overreacted, that I'd humiliated him in front of investors over something that could have been handled privately, that I'd cost him relationships and credibility in the industry out of spite. For a little while, a few people believed that version. It stung more than I expected it to, watching people I'd known for years choose the easier, tidier story, the one where a woman's public anger is the scandal, instead of the years of private lying that caused it. The couple I lost first were the Hendersons, Mark and Renee, friends from a book club Grant and I had joined together back in 2020. Renee called me 2 weeks after the party, and I actually let myself hope for a moment that she was calling to check on me. Instead, she wanted to know why I'd ambushed Grant in front of his investors instead of handling things privately, like adults. You could have ruined his whole career, she said, and I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, feeling something in my chest go tired instead of angry. He was already ruining mine, I told her, quietly, for years. I just did it in a room with better lighting. She didn't have an answer for that. We haven't spoken since. I think about her sometimes, not with bitterness exactly, more with a kind of clinical curiosity about how easily some people will trade the truth for the version of a story that requires less of them. But the story doesn't stay tidy for long once a forged signature and a frozen $5 million enter the picture, and slowly, over the following months, the people who mattered found their way to the truth on their own. Warren and Carol Whitfield were the allies I never expected to keep. I assumed in the immediate aftermath that I would lose them along with Grant, that blood would win out the way it usually does in families. Instead, Carol called me 2 days after the party, crying, apologizing for a version of her son she said she should have questioned years earlier, going all the way back, she admitted, to Vantage Metrics, to a settlement she'd always quietly wondered about but never asked him to explain. Warren was quieter about it, less demonstrative, but he showed up in his own way. He gave a sworn statement to Holt's office about the conversation Grant had with him regarding structuring things months before the sale, a conversation that ended up mattering more than Warren probably realized when he had it. I still have dinner with Carol every few months. It's an odd kind of relationship to keep, an ex-mother-in-law who chose the daughter-in-law over the son, but I've stopped questioning good things just because they arrive in unfamiliar shapes. The strangest ally showed up almost 2 months in, and it took me a moment to place the name when Holt first mentioned it. Ray Doss, Grant's old co-founder from Vantage Metrics, the man Grant had spent years describing as jealous and unstable, the man he'd joked about at that barbecue in Golden, wondering aloud whether integrity paid the bills. Ray had heard about the divorce through a mutual industry contact, and he'd reached out to Holt's office on his own, unprompted, offering to provide a sworn statement about what had actually happened at Vantage Metrics in 2018, the real version, the one that had nothing to do with jealousy. He described in careful, documented detail how Grant had adjusted user growth numbers before a Series A pitch, how Ray had objected, how the eventual settlement had included language quietly discouraging either of them from discussing it publicly. He'd signed the NDA because he had a mortgage and a newborn, and no appetite for a legal fight against a man with more resources than he had. He told Holt he'd spent 6 years watching Grant's career from a distance, wondering if anyone would ever see the pattern he'd tried to warn people about back when it still might have mattered. I never spoke to Ray directly, but I wrote him a short email after everything settled, thanking him. He wrote back 4 words: "I believe you completely." I've kept that email longer than I probably need to. There was a hearing in February, a shorter, more procedural one than the final settlement, where Grant's attorney tried to argue that the HELOC signature question was a miscommunication between spouses rather than forgery, something that could be resolved informally without dragging in fraud examiners. Holt stood up, unhurried, and simply read the forensic report into the record, the analysis of stroke pressure and letter forms, the conclusion that the signature was inconsistent with every verified sample of my handwriting on file. The judge asked Grant's attorney, not unkindly, whether his client had an alternative explanation for how my name had ended up on $85,000 of debt without my knowledge. There wasn't one. I sat in the gallery of that courtroom, 3 rows behind Grant, and watched him stare at the table in front of him for the rest of the hearing, not once turning around. Jenna reached out to me almost a month after the party, a short, careful message through social media, apologizing for something that was never actually her fault. She told me she'd had no idea I existed, that she'd believed every word about the dead parents, the solo founder story, the whole architecture Grant had built specifically, so she'd never asked the questions that might have exposed him sooner. I believed her. I told her so. We've exchanged a handful of messages since then. Nothing close to friendship, but something adjacent to understanding. 2 women who loved the same performance without ever meeting the man behind it at the same time. There were losses in those months too, ones the legal victories didn't touch. I lost a version of a Friday night dinner tradition with a couple we'd been close to for years, who quietly sided with Grant and stopped returning my calls. I lost, more painfully, the easy comfort of being able to talk about my marriage without a story attached to it, without people's faces shifting into that particular mixture of pity and curiosity the moment his name came up. And I lost, longer and slower than either of those, the version of the future I had genuinely believed I was building, not just financially, emotionally. We had talked vaguely about trying for a baby the following year, once the acquisition closed and things settled down. I think about that sometimes, a child who was never more than a conversation over dinner, a life that dissolved before it ever had the chance to become real. I don't know if I mourn the child or just the version of myself who still believed, as recently as that year, that Grant was someone worth building a family with. Maybe both. Grief doesn't usually pick just one thing to be about. The settlement, when it finally came through the following spring, gave me 60% of the marital estate, including the $5 million from the Anchor Point sale. Once the freeze converted into a formal division of assets during the divorce proceedings, it accounted for the $85,000 in home equity Grant had taken and never disclosed, and, at Holt's insistence, an additional amount that traced back almost eerily precisely to the $40,000 I'd given him in 2019 out of my mother's estate, money he'd never once mentioned repaying in 6 years of marriage. It wasn't framed in the paperwork as sentimental. It was framed as an unpaid personal loan with documentation, which, it turned out, was exactly what it had always been, even if neither of us had called it that at the time. Verity compliance itself became a strange, unexpected complication in the months between the party and the final settlement. Anchor Point's legal team, once they learned about the ongoing fraud referral and the frozen funds, insisted on a temporary escrow holdback on top of everything Holt had already secured, worried that the acquisition itself could look compromised if any part of the $5 million was later found to be entangled in a criminal matter. Grant spent months on calls with Anchor Point's counsel, trying to keep the deal from unraveling entirely, and I took a strange, quiet satisfaction in knowing that the empire he'd built to leave me behind was now the very thing keeping him tethered to a slow, humiliating cleanup of his own making. The deal survived eventually, mostly intact, but it survived scarred and slower and worth considerably less in reputation than the number on the closing documents ever suggested. I didn't take the money and disappear the way Grant had once planned to do to me. I put a portion of the settlement into a fund at the hospital foundation, earmarked for nurses pursuing advanced degrees while working full full shifts, something I wished had existed when I was 24 and drowning in tuition and 12-hour rotations. It felt important to build something from all of it that had nothing to do with him at all. The forgery referral led to a separate legal proceeding entirely, one that moved slower and mattered less to my own life than the divorce did, but one that meant Grant spent the better part of a year answering to people who had nothing to do with me at all, people whose job it was to care very specifically about signatures that weren't real. I don't know everything that came of it. I stopped tracking his life closely once the settlement was final, on purpose, because there's a point where following the consequences stops being justice and starts being something closer to obsession, and I didn't want to become someone who needed his ruin in order to feel whole. I sold the house that fall. It felt right, not like running, more like closing a door gently instead of slamming it. I bought a smaller place across town, closer to the hospital, with a kitchen window that catches the morning light in a way our old house never did. I still work in care coordination. I still have dinner with Carol every few months and coffee with Priya every week, the same friend who called her husband the moment I sat down at her kitchen counter with a flash drive that felt radioactive. Dana still calls me too often, and I still love her for it. People sometimes ask me, when they hear the shape of this story, whether I feel like I won. I understand why they ask. There's a satisfying version of this, the one where the wife walks out of the gallery with her head high, where the villain's father calls him a disgrace, where the money that was supposed to disappear ends up mostly in her account instead. I live that version. It happened exactly the way I've told it. But winning isn't quite the word I'd use, because winning implies there was a version of this where I got to keep both things, the money and the marriage I thought I had. There wasn't. There was only ever a version where I finally saw clearly what I'd actually married, and a version where I kept believing, and I chose to see clearly, because I decided, on a closet floor at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, that I would rather have the truth and grieve it than keep the lie and slowly disappear inside it the way he planned for me to. I still think sometimes about the man who held my hand at that vineyard in Boulder, who cried when he told me about Ray Doss, who squeezed my hand before I walked down the aisle without my mother there to walk beside me. I don't think that man was entirely fake. I think he was real, in the small moments he needed to be, and calculating in all the moments underneath. Both of those things were true about Grant Whitfield at the exact same time, and learning to hold both truths at once without letting either one cancel the other out has been the hardest, most honest work of the last 2 years. I don't regret the party. I don't regret the folder on the flash drive, or the calls to Holt, or the quiet, careful weeks of gathering evidence while I stirred dinner and smiled and asked about his day. I built that night the way I was trained to build a treatment plan, methodically, with a clear eye on the outcome, and it worked exactly the way I needed it to. But I've learned not to confuse a plan that worked with a wound that healed. Some nights I still lie in the new house, in the light from a window Grant never saw, and feel the specific quiet ache of mourning a version of my life that never actually existed anywhere, except in my own hopeful imagination. I think, if I'm honest, that's the part nobody tells you about a story like this one. Everyone wants the ending where the projector screen lights up and the villain's father calls him a disgrace, and the wife drives home to watch the movers carry out the last of his things. That part is real, and it is satisfying, and I would build that exact night again without hesitating. But the cameras, so to speak, always cut away right there, at the height of it, because a clean ending is a better story than a true one. The true one keeps going. The true one includes a woman sitting alone at her kitchen table at midnight, waiting to find out if $5 million is actually gone, and a year of hearings and forensic reports and old friends who choose the easier version of events, and a nursery that was never built, and an ex-mother-in-law you still love more than you expected to. Nobody claps for that part. It happens anyway. It's most of what actually healing looks like, if I'm being honest. Quieter and slower and far less photogenic than the night everyone remembers. I found my husband's secret apartment, his hidden girlfriend, and his plan to steal $5 million from me. I invited her to his victory party, and nobody saw what was coming next, including, in the end, me. I didn't know, walking into that gallery in a plain black dress, that the fight wouldn't actually end when the projector screen lit up. I didn't know there would be one more phone call at midnight, one more hour of not knowing whether everything I'd built would hold. It held. Not perfectly, not without cost, but it held. And most days now, that's enough. Most days, I stand in my kitchen with the morning light coming through a window that's entirely mine, and I understand, finally, that surviving something clearly is its own kind of victory, even when it doesn't come with a clean cinematic ending, even when some small, honest part of you still misses the man you thought you married, right up until the day you finally, fully let him go.